We recently got a community question on a video that we had posted inside of our community. And so the video was a video from our YouTube channel that we'd posted inside our community. And in that video, I had talked about some of the things that you should consider doing before you walk into a requirement session. And so some of the points that I covered in that video were that the fact that the majority of your work normally happens outside of your requirement session. And so the prep work before you get into a session is actually usually a lot more involved than the work that you do in the session itself. And the second thing that I talked about here was to make sure that you have handouts that you're going to be handing out in every meeting that you go into. And I talked about some of the benefits of having handouts. So the question that we got from our community member was just around those handouts itself. And so essentially the question asked, it basically said, I would like if you could please elaborate on the content of the handouts. And so our community member here essentially has a process that she goes through to get the requirements and the specifications done. And essentially what that meeting typically requires, or that the process that they go through typically starts off with a blank canvas, meaning that they go into a requirement session with really nothing really ready to look at, and they start the conversation from point zero. And then what they do as part of that process is that they go through and they figure out exactly what the scope should be and what the list of requirements should be. And then what they do is they go through and they elaborate it into the business requirements document, and they continue to iterate over the subject until the requirements is at the level that it needs to be to sign off. And so that's generally the correct process to go through to do requirements. And so normally you have a certain amount of scope that needs to be elaborated, or you have certain business needs that need to be translated into requirements. And essentially what you do is you continue to engage with your stakeholders and you continue to ask probing questions until you get the answers that you need to get sign off on your deliverables. So generally speaking, that is the correct process to go through. Now, the point that I was trying to make in that video was that the going into those sessions should usually never happen with a blank canvas. And so what I've done is I have created for us a sample of what you might want to take into the requirement session that you have for the next set of sessions that you hold for your own projects. And so basically what I've done here is that I've just taken a look at some previous projects that I've done, and I've put together some materials based on where I'm at in the process. So let's just imagine that I am going into the very first session, and what I want to do is I want to understand the data structure. I want to understand the nature of the data that my customers have that they want the solution to track for them. Okay. And so the way I would be capturing that information is that I would be doing it using entity modeling. And so in my handout, the very first thing that I have is I have an agenda that explains to all of the stakeholders exactly what the next hour or next hour and a half is going to look like. Okay. I have a list of the attendees that I've invited, date, title, etc. Pretty straightforward. In my session, what I'd like to do, and basically what I would do is as the people are streaming into the meeting room, I already have the handouts laid out in front of them. And so the first thing they do is we just greet each other. They sit down, they grab the handout, and they start flipping through it to see what is waiting for them for the remaining of the hour or the hour and a half. And the benefit of doing that right away is very, very clear, is that when a person comes in, they're already busy looking at the subject matter. One is that they're already getting some clarity on what the next hour is going to look like for them. Number two, you don't have a collection of people who are just sitting there, staring at you or doing something else. And it takes the pressure off of you to actually have to talk to everybody and everything else during the session itself as people are coming in, right? And so the benefit of having something like this has a lot of benefits. You can watch that YouTube video that we have to get more details on that. But the handout itself basically is going to have an agenda. And in this agenda, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off very lightly, and I'm going to explain some basic concepts about how I captured the data. that they're going to be giving me, how I'm going to be capturing the information about their data that they're going to be giving me in this meeting. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk them through what I like to call a strawman model. And what a strawman basically is your best guess. As an analyst, it's your best guess of what you think that the people in the room are going to tell you. And so basically what I like to do is, before I've even walked into my first session, before I've even actually met any of the people, any of the participants face to face, I do quite a bit of homework to draft up this straw man. And what that does is it gives me some pre-knowledge about the subject area. It gives me it gives me the opportunity to think through at least once what they might ask for. Okay. 90%, 80% of what I've drawn up here is going to be completely wrong, right? But the value of this straw man is the fact that it creates momentum, right? From the very first minute that somebody comes into the room, there is already a certain amount of momentum that's been built up by you having gone through that exercise. You've already built up a certain amount of momentum, so that when the people come into the room and they sit down, you've greeted each other for the first time, you're not saying, okay, well, here's a blank page, let's start the conversation from point zero. What you're saying is that I've done a little bit of homework, I've thought through what I think you're going to ask me for this meeting. We're going to start off with what I think you want. And what I need you to do is to help me correct that model that I've built up. And so normally with the straw man, the very first thing I do is that I tell my participants, this thing is going to be, I'm hoping it's 50% wrong, but chances are it's probably going to be 60, 70, maybe even 80%, maybe even 90% wrong. But the point is that I've given some thought to what it is that I think you need. And now I need your help to help me correct that understanding that I've built up. And so again, the momentum that you've already built up to that is a huge benefit. It's hugely beneficial to kicking the meeting off on the right foot, because now the people are coming in and they're not under the pressure of saying, okay, now I have to start things from scratch to try to explain what's going to happen. They're saying, well, this person's already put a certain amount of thought into this. Now it's just my job to kind of jump into that conversation. The momentum has already been going. I'm just going to help that push. I'm going to help push that along. And I'm going to make sure it gets pushed into the right direction. And the pressure that it takes off of you and that it takes off of everybody else in the room is huge. And the amount of progress that you make even during your first session is very, very different if you take this approach than if you just walk in with a blank page. Okay? Because again, trying to build up momentum from zero in the first meeting is very, very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do. All right. So in my set of handouts, I basically have the agenda that explains what it is that we're going to do. And what I like to always do in my meetings is that I always like to make sure I'm explaining to all of the different stakeholders what the near future is going to look like. And so I always give them an opportunity to ask any questions that they might have. And then very importantly, I always say, okay, here are the next 2 to 3 next steps that we're going to go through. And so I'll give you an example of what that would look like in a data review session, for example. Okay. So I would start off by explaining the agenda in much the same way I just did. To the stakeholders. And then what I would do is, before I even get to this, I would take a quick little poll of the room to see how many people understand the concept entity modeling, right? So I would look around the room and I would say, is there anybody in this room who has not heard the term entity modeling before? And I would expect the majority of the hands to go up. And I would say, okay, that's good. Say just a very brief explanation of what it is. It is, entity modeling is a standard modeling methodology that analysts typically go through in order to capture your needs for the business data that the system is going to capture. And typically what an entity model looks like is something like this. So you'll see a couple of boxes. You'll see a line that relates those boxes, and then you'll have certain things here that talk about the rules of how these two relate to each other. So this is just an example that's not related to what we're talking about here. Let's just imagine that if we're building a system that tracks, for whatever reason, tracks cars, tracks the tires of the cars, and it tracks the number of passengers that a car can have, right? In that system, what we would have is we want to make sure we capture certain data about a car. And so we turn that into an entity. We need to capture some data about a tire. We capture that as an entity, and then we define some rules about how a car is related to its tires. Okay, and so essentially what I'm doing here is I'm educating the group a little bit about how entity modeling works and what it is. Sometimes, especially if you're talking to people who have like very little understanding of data structure, a lot of this might go completely over their heads, and that's okay. Because what we do is we also write it in plain English so that everybody is on the same page. By the second session or by the end of the first session, if I see that the majority of the people in the room are not really feeling this at all, or they're not really getting it, then I would switch gears and I would say, okay, this is something I'm going to produce for the developers on my own. We're just going to speak in basic plain English terms. And so I do a little bit of education, gauge the room to see whether it's something that's going to help them, help me understand this, and then I would actually dive into the actual straw man that I've drafted up. And again, my straw man is based on homework that I've done. I might have looked at similar systems that exist, systems that are similar to what we're building here. I might have gone through some of their internal process documentation ahead of time. I might have sat down with somebody, within the IT group that I have access to that understands this domain much better than I do. And then what I would do is based on that, I would say, okay, I know there are certain pieces of data that we need to start capturing. I've put those here on the page. And again, I recognize the fact that this may be 50, 60, 70, 80% wrong. I need you to help me understand all of the different data elements that we need to capture. And then I need you to give me a little bit more clarity on how all those different data elements are related to each other. And again, so when I put something like this up, immediately a few people are going to be like, well, you know what, this part of it is wrong, that part of it's wrong. And I would say, yep, that's totally legitimate. So then what I would do normally in a session is that I would switch over to the actual entity model itself. And as they're speaking and they're saying, okay, well, there's a relationship between this, and this relationship is like a one to many, etc. We would start to do that session and based on the straw man that's been built up. Okay. So again, going back to the handout itself, essentially what you're doing is you're including everything that you're going to need to discuss in that session. And again, much of the benefit in having a handout is the fact that it takes the pressure off of you. It takes the pressure off of everybody else in the room because they have something tangible now and they know what's going to be discussed. They can even start to start making notes on the sheets that you've given them, and it gives them a certain amount of momentum that they can write off of. And so this is just an example of one of the types of meetings that I would hold throughout a project. Once we've gone through this, we've gotten some clarity where, let's say we've got it about 70, 80% correct. I would say, okay, well, we're running out of time. What I'd like to do is to take the next few minutes to ask if anybody has any questions. And then I would field any questions that they have. And I'd say, okay, well, next steps, what we're going to do is we're going to actually dive a level deeper into understanding your data by detailing out exactly what data elements each of those entities is going to need to capture. And so what I've done here is I've already created a simple little template just as a preview, but in the next session, we're going to go through and we're going to start adding all the data elements into here so that I have a very clear understanding of what type of data you need to have captured in the new system. And so, and one of the other things I would normally say to them is, if you have any information that can help me strawman this out a little bit more, please feel free to send it over. If you have any process documentation, or if you have any system screenshots of the existing systems or Excel spreadsheets that you use, please send that stuff over to me, because what I can do is I can take my first kick at the can at producing this so that we're not walking in with a blank sheet. Okay. And so this kind of gives them a bit of a preview of what it is that they're going to see in the next session or in the next few sessions. And so once you've done this, then you can iterate back over, go back to the entity model, come back to this, and you would basically just iterate through this until this is exactly where it needs to be, to the point where the developers can start their part of the work. Okay. So I hope that this has been helpful. This is a lot of what I've taken out here is some of the course material that we're going to have in our the next course that we're coming up with for requirements and specifications. But I hope that this has given you a little bit more clarity about the type of things that you want to include in your own handouts. Now, I've had handouts that have been like 1 or 2 pages for some meetings, and then I've had handouts that have been over 60, 70, 80 pages for other sessions. And it really all depends on the subject matter that you need to discuss and the reference information that you need to have available, just in case somebody asks a question, you want to be able to flip through and have an answer available in one of your handouts, right? So again, I hope that this gives you a much more in-depth understanding of the type of things you could have in your own handouts. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and I'll do my best to elaborate further if I need to.